Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian. I am Bandy Bono, and it's been a while, YouTube. Sci-Fi Christian, of course, has been rolling on steady as ever over in our main podcast, which, if you're not familiar with, you can find out all about that at thescifichristian.com. However, when it comes to YouTube, it's been quite a few months, actually. Kind of needed a break. We did a lot of stuff in the beginning part of the year with the Dante series and, of course, Game of Thrones and everything. So had some other irons in the fire podcasting project-wise and needed to get taken care of. So just need a little bit of a break, but I am back and excited to kick off a mini-series here for the fall/winter, I guess, since it's almost December. That's going to kind of be, I'm thinking of this similarly to how I thought of and put together the Fantasy in the Academy series last year. If you're not familiar with that, that's where I looked at a few different fantasy authors and kind of showed how their respective series can shine some light on some different academic topics and how thinking about those topics can in turn help us to gain new appreciation for those series. So I kind of wanted to do another series like that. I may eventually come back and do a second iteration of Fantasy in the Academy. I'm kind of rolling that around in my head right now, thinking of who or what series might be good for that. But I like that concept of just kind of having a short contained series like that. So I'm coming back with that here in a series that starts today. Much like Fantasy in Academy, it's going to be 4 parts. And it's going to be an introduction, and then we're going to focus on 3 different works for the subsequent 3 parts. And this series I am calling, Why Would You Watch That? Why would you watch that? And let me give you a little bit of background on what this is and where this is coming from. So what this series is I'm going to be looking at 3 different movies over the next 3 weeks that typically kind of get the reaction of, oh, that has a lot of objectionable content in it, or that's not something a Christian should watch, or, you know, it's gross, it's wrong to watch that, it's got a lot of content that would typically turn Christians off to engaging with it. And what I find is that when it comes to content like that, and people find out that, you know, we're a Christian podcast site that's doing, say, Game of Thrones reviews, a lot of times the reaction we get is, why would anyone watch that? Why would a Christian watch that? Now, sometimes the reaction is a little less gracious and just simply jumps to the conclusion, Christians shouldn't watch that. And that reaction bothers me, and I want to, but rather than just dismissing it, I want to discuss it in a nuanced and concrete way, hence this series. Now, you've heard me mention that I'm kind of coming at this more from a Christian angle. We don't always do that here so much on the YouTube side, but it fits in this case. But it's not exclusively that, because to go back to the example of Game of Thrones, and I'll stay spoiler-free, but if you watch our videos from this last year, and if you were watching the show, you know that there was an incident in the show that caused quite a hubbub, not just among Christians, but among people at large, and there were cries that the show was misogynistic, and this, that, and the other thing, and that nobody should watch it, and I think there was even a politician, some congresswoman who came out, or a senator, and said, you know, she wasn't going to watch anymore because of what had happened on the show. And so that was a largely more secular reaction, but I kind of had the same thought process as I do when I get challenged by Christians about the fact that we cover Game of Thrones here on the Sci-Fi Christian. Which is that, well, wait a second, maybe some of that objectionable content that people are reacting to isn't good, but I think that art requires us to be more thoughtful than that. And so rather than just reacting, let's think about this a little bit. Let's think about what's going on there. Let's not just be reactionary. Let's not just be dismissive. And so this series is a chance to say, instead of whether people are coming at it from a secular angle or a Christian angle, when it comes to kind of what I think of as the big 3 of violence, sex, or nudity, and profanity, though we won't cover profanity that much because I don't really care about that so much. We need to have a more nuanced approach to how we think about those things. And unfortunately, I see a lot of people being very simplistic. Now, in fairness to people who are watching and are maybe bothered by those things, I think people who watch those elements in movies or read about them in books or whatever and aren't bothered by them often have simplistic reactions too. It's the fact that somebody isn't bothered by something or doesn't have that, oh, why would you watch that reaction, doesn't necessarily mean they're being a complex thinker or engaging with those elements in the way that we ought to either. So hopefully this series will be a chance to, although that's not going to be the main emphasis, hopefully bring maybe some people who are in that side of the equation on it and hopefully get us all thinking about this more no matter which direction you're coming from, whether it's from a Christian direction who's bothered, a secular direction where you saw something like what was in Game of Thrones and were bothered, or just somebody who doesn't care. Hopefully we can all through this series start thinking more deeply about art and the presence of so-called objectionable material in art. So the three movies that we are going to cover, two of them sci-fi, one of them not, but it fits anyway. The three movies that we are going to cover are, next week we'll cover Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. Number 2 weeks from now, we will cover Michael Fassbender's Shame, which is a phenomenal movie, though definitely one that fits this category. And 3 weeks from now, we will cover the ever-famous, ever-disturbing The Exorcist. Okay? Needless to say, I'm going to get into spoilers for all those movies, so if you want to have time to check them out, that's your schedule. 1 week from now, A Clockwork Orange. 2 weeks from now, Shame. And 3 weeks from now, The Exorcist. All right, but for this introduction then, what I want to do to kind of set the table a little bit for our discussion about those movies is I'm going to cover 5 assumptions that I'm going to be bringing into this conversation. And these are going to form the baseline for our discussion about these movies. So I'll be referring back to these over the coming weeks. Some are relevant to all the movies, some only relevant to 1 or 2 of them, but these will form the foundation for the conversation I want to have about these movies over the next several weeks. So number 1, something that you've heard me say many times, especially if you're a listener of the Sci-Fi Christian podcast, but it needs to be reiterated here, that stories are about more than fun and entertainment. I honestly think this is where a lot of the confusion on the evaluation of objectionable content comes in, because, for example, you see somebody being brutally murdered or worse, raped or whatever on screen, and people think, well, why would you watch that? And they're coming at it from the context that you watch something for the purpose of entertainment. And so the assumption that's behind that question then at that point is, why are you being entertained by something so horrific? And the further assumption behind that would be, if you are entertained by something so horrific, there's probably something wrong with you. And to that I would say, okay, that's a fair point. But what if I'm not watching exclusively for entertainment? What if there's more to art? What if there's more to stories than just my own amusement? Because yeah, if I'm only watching from a pure sense of amusement, then yes, probably all 3 of these movies are fairly messed up in different ways from a pure sense of amusement. Okay? I think all 3 of these movies and many others, including Game of Thrones, are entertaining in their own way, but need to go deeper than that. Okay? Now, I will say that sometimes a director or a writer will bring in some of this objectionable content in an entertaining way to subvert us and the audience, and we'll talk about that more, especially next week with a Clockwork Orange, where I think that's a very big component of that movie. All right, number 2, evaluating adult content requires as much thought and complexity as any other part of the story. This is one that really gets me. Like, you can hear people who, okay, maybe they're not just watching for entertainment. They understand a movie is intelligent. They understand a story requires thought, and they're analyzing it. They're willing to engage with the themes and the ideas and everything. But then you get to the sex scene, Oh, that's just unnecessary. Well, wait a second here. Why do we all of a sudden become simplistic thinkers the second that objectionable content enters the frame? Right? Why do we just become, just turn off our brains essentially and say, bad, 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 that shouldn't happen, that shouldn't happen? You know, again, to refer back to Game of Thrones, a lot of these same people, these same websites that were howling for blood at this scene that occurred in the last season are sites that have written thoughtful articles about the show and its themes and its ideas. And so the idea that, you know, you can analyze a show right up until something that bothers me, that I find objectionable, enters the screen. I don't think you can do that. Does that mean that you can't have a nuanced approach? No. We'll talk about that in a second. But it does mean that you have to continue to be an engaged and complex thinker, even when you're thinking of the parts that maybe you don't like, that maybe you find morally problematic, or that just bother you in some way. Okay, so number 3, as I just mentioned, it is okay to have a nuanced approach to this. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, we're not going to the other extreme where now every single piece of objectionable content should be embraced. Okay, we can be nuanced. There probably is such a thing as gratuitous, sex, violent, whatever. You know, there are movies that maybe use those elements in a way that are wrong, that shouldn't occur. I can think of some, I'm sure you can too, and if sex and violence aren't your thing, just substitute whatever it is that bothers you in there. However, the flip side of that is that we need to be very, very careful to not let nuanced thinking cause us to fall back into becoming simplistic thinkers. This is kind of what I pair with number 2, that we need to be complex thinkers. And then the flip side of that is, okay, go ahead and be nuanced, just be very careful with being nuanced, because a lot of times that nuanced thinking becomes that excuse. And what I like to think of, you know, in terms of how we protect ourselves in this, is I get really uneasy when I hear people throwing around terms like gratuitous or unnecessary and saying, well, wait a second here. There is such a thing as gratuitous or unnecessary content, but that shouldn't be a label we just slap on whenever we see something we don't like, and that is often what happens. And that's what I want to push back on, is say, well, hold on. You can have that opinion, but that opinion needs to be well reasoned and thought out and articulated and not just a reactionary thing. And if we're labeling something gratuitous in a reactionary sort of way, I think we have made a mistake. That's my argument. Number 4, it's wrong to compromise another person's art. Okay? There's a service that I've seen advertised on Facebook lately. I'm not going to say the name of it because I don't want to give them free advertising, where you have the option to stream movies. And I've just looked at the screenshots for it. I haven't, and I'm not going to use the service. But essentially, it looks like they have a whole bunch of different options there where you can select to edit out scenes of strong violence, or edit out, you know, the F word, or all profanity, or, you know, you just kind of select your options for what you have. And you basically get a customized version of a movie that is cleaned up to your sensibilities. Now, let me just say, I understand the attraction here. You know, you look at the comments on this site, and people are just ripping them to shreds, and I don't like that, because I do think the intentions are good, and I understand the mindset, and I understand the attraction. I have young kids. You know, my 7-year-old and my 5-year-old, we just watched 2001 this last week. Of course, I don't get everything, but it was great, and that's a great movie to sit down and watch with them. You know, I love showing them movies, so maybe they don't understand everything, but, you know, they can get exposed to some of this great work. I watched, with my 7-year-old, we watched Lawrence of Arabia about a month ago, and again, she didn't get everything, but she enjoyed it a lot. There's other movies, yeah, I'd love to sit down and watch with them, but, you know, there's stuff that's just not age appropriate in there for them. You know, not any of these 3 movies we're going to be talking about. Those are pretty much, you'd have to just edit out half the movie in those cases. But, you know, there's other movies that maybe they contain a scene of nudity. And outside of that, I'd love to show, you know, my kids that movie. And the temptation is to do something like this, to either use one of these services or fast forward through a scene or hit the mute button because they're about to say the F word or, whatever it might be. I understand that desire, but I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. I think that there has to be some humility to say that's not my place to be editing that. It's not my place to compromise somebody else's vision. And especially not, in most cases where you haven't taken the time to really think about what that vision is and what the purpose of that art is. Does that mean it's wrong, if you're watching The Exorcist and you're just scared out of your mind, shut your eyes for a minute? No, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the purposeful and intentional censoring of another person's art. I just think it's wrong. I think that if you're not willing to take the whole thing in, you're probably just better left skipping it altogether. I really believe that. And again, that's something we'll talk about, and I'll use some examples of why I think that matters as we get into these next 3 movies. Finally, if adult content reveals reactions in us that we don't like, that might be a good thing. Okay? And this is where, I do want to be careful because I have said many times in the past, and I do believe it, that when it comes to things like, say Game of Thrones, if you watch that show and you feel like, oh man, this, as a Christian, this is taking me to a bad place, I'm not sure I should watch it. I've said, okay, then don't watch it. That's okay. It's okay to say, I don't like that this is making me lustful or whatever. On the other hand, I do think that there's an element here that we need to be careful not to overlook, which is that sometimes art is meant to reveal those gross or wrong or broken reactions in us. And when we have those reactions, we instantly jump to, oh, I shouldn't have watched that. Maybe you shouldn't have, but maybe it's also a good thing if art can reveal some of that stuff in you. Again, that's an issue that's very individual and requires some nuance, but I think that is a category we at least need to be willing to think in when it comes to evaluating art. Alright, so that does it for the introduction. I will be back in 1 week with A Clockwork Orange, a disturbing, controversial, and ingenious movie, and I am greatly looking forward to it. Until then, I am Benny Bonham. This is Sci-Fi Christian. Goodbye.